Welcome to the first of GCD Philosophy's speaker series, the first speaker in our series. Today, Chad Kautzer, professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado, Denver, will be talking to you. He earned his PhD from Stony Brook, and he works in continental philosophy, particularly in social and political philosophy, and specializing in the work of Hegel. Today, he will be talking to you about Hegel and Egypt, from Orientalism to recognition. I want to point out one thing first. Why did I do this before I introduce him? I don't know. Our next speaker will be October the 18th. Mark Bauer, who's sitting with us now, will be talking about decoupling teleosemantics and selection. So let's put that on hold. Right now, let's think about Hegel and Egypt. Don't think about that right now. It'll totally get started. Think about Hegel from Egypt, from Orientalism to recognition. Chad Kautzer.
First order of business. Does everybody have a handout? I actually don't. Is there an extra? Just so I can like.
I don't have any more.
There were some around.
Okay, cool. I'll just use that. Just so I can follow along. So the paper is that I'm going to be talking through. I'm going to be talking through it today because it's not a finished paper. It's not a finished project. For those of you who know me, I'm interested in Hegel. I'm interested in contemporary politics happening in what's called the Arab Spring right now in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm interested in the topic of Orientalism. And so all of these are coming together right now. And actually there's three particular factors or variables that are coming together that are making me think about this. One is a new translation of Hegel's lectures in the philosophy of world history. This hasn't been translated. It's the first scholarly translation into English ever, but it's the first translation of most of this material since 1867. And the edition that was done then was different series of lecture notes thrown together and kind of pieced together into a narrative that suited the editor quite a bit. And so there is, and this was released just 2 or 3 months after the uprisings in Egypt started. So we have this translation of Hegel's philosophy of history, which is provocative. Many of you, I know, because I recognize you, have some familiarity, at least with the introduction to that text. The second one is obviously the uprising in Egypt. And the third is Edward Said's book Orientalism. If you're not familiar with this book, it's a very good book. It's still very relevant. It was published in '78 and is kind of an overview and critique of what is basically a Eurocentric ideology of domination vis-a-vis the East or the Orient. And interesting enough, in Said's book, he never touches Hegel. He never even mentions Hegel. He skips over Hegel. He goes right from his immediate predecessors and goes to Marx, and he skips Hegel. And I find this fascinating. This isn't completely unusual in the history of ideas because Hegel's quite difficult, and so it's always hard to say a few things about Hegel unless you have quite a good understanding of Hegel. But in producing a critique of Orientalism, if you've read Hegel's philosophy at all, and are at all familiar with it, he is a quintessential Orientalist thinker, and very influential. Hegel's philosophy of history was perhaps the most important influence on Marx's philosophy of history. So this is incredibly important and left out of what is otherwise a really brilliant critique of Orientalist thought. So those are the things that are all coming together at one time for me to make me think about this project of Hegel and Egypt. And the idea here is that it's not a topic that's just about the past, it's not a topic that's just about a philosophy of history, and it's not a topic that's just about the present. Because we're talking about the construction of concepts and interpretive, in a sense, paradigms of our experience that have accumulated over centuries, the past is alive in the present. Right? It is, in a sense, inflecting, creating knowledge now about what's happening in, for example, Egypt. And so when I start to go through some of the points or kind of principles of Hegel's philosophy of history, you know, the first reaction might be, this is Eurocentric claptrap, this is nonsense, this is ridiculous, who could think these things? And it's very easy, I would caution against that response, because the claim that I'm making is that claptrap Eurocentric nonsense is still incredibly alive and operative in our interpretations of what's happening in Egypt. And so it's not just about an Orientalist view that happened way back when with this crazy guy Hegel or with some of his contemporaries, but there's an Orientalism now. And maybe Hegel's ideas can tell us something about it, to in a sense diagnose it. And then the kicker for my thesis is that Hegel provides us with a principle to, in a sense, critique it. And that principle is the principle of recognition or mutual recognition. And so, since I'm just talking through my introduction, the grand build-up, the point I'm trying to make is going to be, or is the thesis I want to defend, is that Orientalism is a form of misrecognition. And the same critique that happens in Hegel's philosophy in interpersonal relations, social relations within a polity, his critique of misrecognition or non-recognition or relations of dominance, is also applicable and actually enlightening and insightful when applied to international relations. And so we can think of Orientalism as a form or ideology of misrecognition, and then be able to apply Hegel's critique and analysis of recognition to that context. Right, so that's the idea. A little judo move with Hegel. We, in a sense, analyze Hegel's Oriental philosophy of history and critique it using Hegel's own concepts of recognition. Or we shall see. That's the idea. That's the idea. Okay, so let me talk about that claptrap. So Hegel's philosophy of history, and I'll just read here for a bit, and then I will indicate to you when I'm going to read a quote that's on your handout. So if I'm going to quote and I'm not saying it's on your handout, it's just something short, and I can provide it for you. Okay, so let me begin by sketching out Hegel's philosophy of history in the broadest of terms, before moving to the specific analysis he gives of Egypt and its position in or outside of world history. According to Hegel, history is the realization or actualization of spirit, Geist, and spirit's progression is its coming to self-consciousness. Now, there are a lot of different definitions of spirit. It is not an easy concept or process or principle or idea to grasp, but I'm going to give you an idea, kind of rendition of what spirit is here. We could think of spirit as the entirety of intersubjective structures and norms that make possible human thinking and acting, together with the actual human thinking and acting that they enable. So in a sense, the structural conditions and possibility of action and thinking, as well as the action and thinking that is made possible by those structures. Hoping that as I talk about this, it'll become clear what I mean, but we're gonna call spirit that for now. Okay, so the idea here is that we might not be aware that our thoughts and acts are structured and norm-based, or how they are structured and norm-based, but they are regardless of how we think about them. Our growing awareness of this fact, and thus our coming to realize that we are thinking and acting, or what we are as thinking and acting beings, constitutes what I'm calling a three-dimensional social historical process that plays out between both theoretical and practical levels. How does this work? So first, our thinking and acting are made possible by these structures and norms, which Hegel calls in general consciousness. And in its first stage, we're calling it subjective spirit. Second, the activities engendered by consciousness produce new material conditions, articulated social norms, reproducible social relations, etc. And these are what Hegel calls objective spirit. Gesundheit. So this is basically the objectification, materialization, externalization of something that was prior in thought, in concept, somehow only in form, but not yet having content. Its objectification produces, in a sense, our world, the institutions in our world, the world that we inhabit, the world that we reflect on, to learn about the selves that produced that world. In this sense, Hegel writes, the substantial physical world is subordinated to the spiritual. So somehow the spiritual or the conceptual precedes and is superior to its manifestation or externalization in the world. This is the process of growing self-awareness or self-consciousness, and it is the precondition of freedom. Big words, big words. Why? Because we remain unfree or incapable of a kind of self-determination, Selbstbestimmung, to the extent that we attribute our powers, our essence, our concept to something other than ourselves. It is, in a sense, a self-misunderstanding. We cannot be free in the Hegelian sense of freedom if we do not understand the nature of ourself, because not understanding the nature of ourself makes us attribute or project or misunderstand our nature because we've put it somewhere else, somewhat exterior to or external to the subject or the self. And as long as that's the case, we are not free in Hegel's sense. So to become free, and this is the third dimension of that social historical process, we must identify the first and second dimensions, that subjective and objective dimension. We must identify these two dimensions to the extent that we realize in a speculative or reconciling moment that our self and our object, the world, are not external to each other. That they are, in a sense, to be seen as two moments within one whole. I'm going to try to flesh this out. This is the meat and potatoes of Hegel's thought, and it's very difficult if you're not familiar with this kind of language. And I'm doing a disservice because I'm trying to generalize it too. One way to think in German, object is Gegenstand. Gegenstand is the Gegen and Stand. Gegen is against, and Stand is like to stand, so to stand against something. So an object is that which is standing against the subject. And the object here, in spiritual terms, is manifest ideas, concepts, the will of human beings. And what Hegel wants to do is see those two as reflected in each other so that we capture them as, in a sense, a circuit or different moments of a development, right? But within a whole. So that the subject and object are not radically distinct. For those of you who have had Kant before, this move has already been made insofar as the objects of our experience are constituted by the concepts or categories of the understanding. We are actively, as subjects, constituting those objects of experience in our world. So in a sense, we have, even in Kant, so prior to Hegel, we have, in a sense, a bridging or an overcoming of a radical divide between subject and object. Hegel wants to radicalize that even further. Okay, so for Hegel, this realization of, in a sense, the continuity of subject and object is what he calls the absolute. It is the identity of subject and object. And it's only with that identity, only with that coming together of subject and object, that the self can no longer have anything external to it, and thus be free. There's nothing outside of it, there is no exterior to the self. And Hegel writes, world history is the progress of the consciousness of freedom, a progress whose necessity we have to recognize, end quote. So, for Hegel, the entirety of human history is the realization of freedom. And we're going to see how he breaks up history into stages or periods is defined by, or in relation to, a principle of freedom. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, Hegel's idea of freedom is pretty different than what we often think of, at least in colloquial terms, as freedom, which is usually what we call negative freedom. This is the most prominent concept of freedom in U.S. discourse and in politics. Idea is that we are free to the extent that we have nothing inhibiting our choice. There is nothing outside of us which prevents us from acting in a way that we choose. We call this negative freedom. And positive freedom is somehow a self-mastering or the materialization of one's will. This has much more to do with kind of internal conditions, the ability to have individual flourishing, develop projects, etc. So it has much more to do with the internality of the self than external things preventing it from happening or preventing its choices from being realized. And Hegel takes that positive sense and gives it a really radical twist. So the idea is that not only is freedom about realization, about manifesting one's will, that freedom is somehow connected up with a self that is radically social. So that somehow to be free means that we have to recognize our interdependency, our interconnectedness, and what some call intersubjectivity. So this is one important feature of Hegel's concept of freedom. I'm trying to build a little picture here before we look at his philosophy of history. So one feature is this socialization of freedom. And another feature, actually, and let me look at quote 1 on your handout. This is the first quote that captures this first feature of freedom. So he says, spirit's freedom is an independence from the other that is achieved not outside the other but in the other. That should be obvious, right? Spirit's freedom is an independence from the other that is achieved not outside the other but in the other. So independence in the other. The second feature goes to the second quote on the handout. And that's Hegel's concept of freedom contains within itself, he says, the infinite necessity to bring itself to consciousness and to actuality, for its very concept is to know itself. Freedom is itself the end or purpose of its own operation, the sole end of spirit. As I say, freedom as a concept and potential not only precedes freedom as manifest in the world, but there's something about the nature of the concept of freedom that compels it to become manifest in the world. So freedom is a concept, and part of that concept is to become manifest in the world. It is not somehow neutral to becoming manifest. It is, in a sense, compelled internally to become manifest. It would not be an exaggeration to say that world history is the history of the manifestation of the concept of freedom for Hegel. So if we think about, I was trying to draw the distinction between the theoretical and the practical, and saying that there are these three dimensions that are, it's played out in three dimensions. Those three dimensions are the dialectic, 3 moments of the dialectic, basically. And on the top of your handout, I gave 3 moments of the dialectic. And the idea here is that you have a concept which is, in a sense, universal, undefined, unlimited, which then becomes manifest, or there's an instantiation of it in the world, so it becomes finite or particular. And that's the second moment, or second dimension. That's the objectification, or the objective dimension of the dialectic. Right? And then the third moment is the reconciling moment of the first 2, right? Of the concept and its particularization or objectification. So those are the 3 dimensions, and those 3 dimensions are, in a sense, playing out between the theoretical and the practical, between the conceptual and the material, between the self and the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So Hegel's idea here is that the concept of freedom, that first moment in the dialectic, is universal, unlimited, unmediated, it's immediate. It becomes manifest in the world. There's some instantiation of a concept of freedom in the world, in an institution, in social practices, in laws, in norms, etc. And then the third moment is somehow the reconciliation between the concept and that particularization. Right? And this is, in a sense, the operation of the motor of history for Hegel. The entire history of the world can be written in terms of the manifestation of the concept of freedom in its different dialectical stages. It's a bold move. Because I can see I've sold you on this idea. And there's no reason to go on, really. Okay, but I'll go on. So, just to recap, there are 2 features of the concept of freedom here. One is that there's some kind of original social dimension to individual freedom, and 2, that the concept of freedom itself has a structure which compels it to become manifest in the world. Those are, I would say, probably 2 of the defining features of Hegel's concept of freedom here, at least in the context of history. Okay, so let me go to the first one, the first feature, which is the social dimension. What's so remarkable about this dimension is that we are free only through another. We are with ourselves only in an other. Bei sich selbst sein in einem anderen, he says. This feat of social individuality is made possible by reciprocal recognition or Anerkennung. This is the aforementioned, or one of the aforementioned, intersubjective structures that I said was part of the definition of spirit. An intersubjective structure of recognition. In his philosophy of spirit, Hegel writes, and this is the 3rd quote on the handout, universal self-consciousness is the affirmative knowledge of itself in another, Each self is a free individuality that has his own absolute independence, yet in virtue of the negation of its immediacy or desire, without distinguishing itself from that other. Each is thus universal self-consciousness and objective. Each has its real individuality, or sorry, its real universality in the shape of reciprocity. So far as each knows itself to be recognized in the other's freedom, and knows this insofar as it recognizes the other and knows him to be free. Let me reread that last sentence. Each is thus universal self-consciousness and objective. Each has its real universality in the shape of reciprocity. So far as each knows itself to be recognized in the other's freedom, and knows this insofar as it recognizes the other and knows him to be free. Thus, freedom is only possible through recognition by an other. So my freedom is dependent upon the recognition of others of my freedom. It's not that I'm free and I want you to recognize my freedom. I don't become free until you recognize me as free. The problem is, I have to recognize you as free in order to enable you to be free and freely recognize me as free. That's the reciprocity. And the difficulty. And for Hegel, the source of most of tragedy in history is a misunderstanding of that. Some of you I know have read the Lordship and Bondage, Master-Slave Dialectic, Struggle for Recognition in the Phenomenology of Spirit. The short story of that is that Hegel is, in this early work, drawing out, in a sense, the logical, structural dimension of the development of self-consciousness, insofar as the development of my self-consciousness and thus my freedom is dependent upon someone else. So I'm interdependent. And the master-slave, it's called a master-slave dialectic because we have a master and a slave. We have a struggle to get others to recognize us. So we try to compel the other to recognize us. And that struggle can end in a hierarchy, a relational hierarchy, where one is subordinate to another. Now, if we were talking in terms of physical, in the sense of subordination, enslavement, it would be fine. It works out quite well. You get the other person, you're the master, they're the slave, you get them to do the work for you. You actually don't, in a sense, negate the world, the earth, they produce everything for you, you consume, it's all good. I'm not justifying slavery. I'm just saying that there are no problems with recognition if we don't define it in Hegel's terms, in the sense that they recognize my authority. They say, well, they acknowledge my authority. They're following the rule of my authority. And for Hegel, that's not good enough, because the recognition of my subjectivity has to come freely from the other, and I have to at the same time be recognizing them as a free subject willing to give it. And I am not, as a master, doing that with a slave. And so we get this relationship that is self-defeating. So I'm trying to coerce what can only come freely, and thus I never get what I'm trying to get, which is free recognition from another, and therefore I am not free. Right? So this is the 90-second version of the struggle for recognition that happens in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And that's what we're mostly familiar with when we talk about recognition. And that principle is consistent throughout Hegel's system. The idea is that we cannot be free until we recognize our interdependence on others and recognize them as free. Okay. So in the encyclopedia, Hegel will write, "The master confronted by his slave was not yet truly free, for he was still far from seeing in the former, in the slave, himself. Consequently, it's only when the slave becomes free that the master too becomes completely free." So my relation to the other is thus a self-relation. The I is merely a different moment within the circuit of recognition for Hegel, within a we. And in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel famously says the I that is a we and a we that is an I, to try to get at the intersubjective structure of the I. It is a we. In every I, there is a we. It is a difference, however, that is no difference, meaning it's not ontologically distinct, but they are logically different moments. In short, if I don't realize that my individual autonomy is constituted through intersubjective and interdependent relations, the self will never be realized, and thus the self cannot become self-determining. It cannot be free in this condition of misrecognition. Okay. So that was that one feature of freedom, which is the social dimension of freedom. The other element of freedom is the concept that's compelled, in a sense, internally to externalize itself. And that will determine the stages of history by the externalization of this concept. So Hegel's idea of history thus runs something like this. History begins with a lack of self-awareness and thus a lack of freedom. But the concept of freedom involves making itself known, externalizing itself. Thus history is the process of freedom making itself known, the working out of the concept, which is another way of saying the process of spirit becoming self-conscious. For the essence of spirit is freedom. Because the structure of the concept is dialectical, its unfolding will have three stages. There's three stages that were listed at the top of your handout. As to say, each stage of history is defined by a particular level of development of freedom, which follows the structure of the dialectic, this immediacy, mediation, and then reconciliation or mediated universality. And for those of you, it doesn't matter what you're reading in Hegel, everything will be in threes. And everything is in threes because everything is mediated through concepts. And concepts are structured as they are dialectical. So everything that we produce, everything that we think, every relation, everything has a triadic form to it. It's somehow structured in threes because the spiritual has preeminence and the spiritual is dialectical or has a triadic structure. So that's why Hegel once criticized Kant for, doing everything in threes, but not knowing why he was doing everything in threes. He wasn't self-aware of the fact that it was necessarily so. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the next quote. And I'm not paying attention to time, actually. Okay. And I noticed, sorry about that, I noticed the quotes are getting longer as I go down. It's like I'm demanding more and more. So my apologies for that. But so let's look at the stage theory of history of freedom that he has. So he says in the first stage, spirit remains immersed in the natural state in which it exists in a condition of unfree singularity. In this state, one is free. In the second stage, spirit emerges into consciousness, or into the consciousness of its freedom. But this first breaking loose is complete and partial. In this case, some are free, because it originates from the immediacy of the natural state it is related to and is still encumbered with it as a moment. So he's saying that somehow, even though there's progress, it's still anchored to something regressive. In the third stage, spirit is elevated out of this still particular freedom into freedom's pure universality. And in this case, the human being as such is free. And kind of, this is the universal moment, as such, as being a human being, not a particular human being, but the universal component of the human being is to be free. And this is elevated into self-consciousness and self-awareness of the essence of spirituality. These stages are fundamental principles of the universal process. Now, if this three-stage philosophy of history was not provocative enough for you, Hegel adds a little extra to that, which is that since spirit is embodied in the institutions we produce, so this is the objectification of spirit in our institutions, in our worlds, as we make our worlds. So since they're, those worlds are produced by semi-coherent organizations of people in nations or states, then spirit manifests itself as a national spirit. The national spirit, and later the state, will thus be the smallest unit of analysis for Hegel in the philosophy of world history. So the idea here is that we're dealing with, in world history, we're dealing with nations and states. We're not dealing with, and they are the individuals of history. We're not dealing with individuals like us as natural persons. So, that being the case, we can overlay the tripartite division of freedom at its stages. We can put that onto, graph that onto the history of different civilizations, different peoples, and then categorize them as, in a sense, manifesting different stages of freedom. It's another bold move. So this is one of those bold moves where you think, that's dumb. You know, you may even say there's something like reason in history, but it's not that reasonable in the sense that there's this triadic division and progressive. But Hegel is saying that very specifically. Reason is in history. History does manifest as a dialectical process, and thus in this triadic form. And in a sense, the engine pushing history forward is the concept of freedom. Or pushing history forward is freedom, working itself out. That means, and I'm just going to skip a lot of stuff here because of time, that we get things like Egypt or the Orient is infancy, it's immediacy, and then the Greek Empire is adolescence, and the Roman Empire is like young adulthood, and this is the growth of freedom as a concept, right? And then full kind of developed old age maturity is, he calls it the Germanic nations, which means Europe. Kind of makes all of Europe Germanic, and that's because of Christianity. And so what he does is he takes what before this time period was maybe seen as episodic and not progressive, and he writes a narrative that makes it progressive, and the progress is in the manifestation of freedom. That's in a sense how we catalog different civilizations. And the idea, then we can talk about, okay, well what about freedom here? Well, the Greeks, they had a breakthrough in the sense that they had this idea of citizenship and self-determination, so that it wasn't just a despot, they had democracy. Democracy is somehow the recognition that some people within the polity, not just the despot, should have the power of self-determination. Romans also had that. Christianity, recognition, we're all God's children, there's a universality, that's where we get the recognition. Christianity is, in a sense, an ideology of freedom, of each individual as being a universal or an instantiation of a universal, and they are themselves, as such, free. So that's kind of how he does the progression. I talked about the Greeks saying that some are free. The idea is that in Egypt, in the Orient, the East in general, you have despotism. The only people who are, in a sense, given legitimacy or authority to make decisions and determining one's life is the despot, is one ruler. So we're going from despotism to, in a sense, a Christian idea of equality and freedom in every person. Right? At least in their essence. They may live in slavery, but they are essentially free if they have recognized, in a sense, Christian ideology. So this is the grand scheme of things, the big picture that he paints. Okay, I'm just going to skip to quote 5. I'm just going to say a few words about, what I want to do is say a few words about the historical Egypt and Hegel's concept of freedom, or world history, and then talk about Orientalism, and how we can talk about contemporary politics in Egypt and interpretations of Egypt today with some of these things in mind. I just want to make sure we have enough time for that, and I want to make sure that there's a good Q&A session, because this is throwing a lot of stuff out. Okay, so let's just look at quote number 5. This, by the way, is one of those things where you read it and think, at least I do, I think Hegel's clever. It's clever. It's a nice interpretation. So he says, the symbol of Egypt is the Sphinx, this twofold figure, half animal and half human, and indeed female, which for Hegel is very important because he has a theory of sex difference that's terrible but powerful in the sense that it determines a lot of his philosophy. I'm just going to set that aside. We can talk about that Q&A. It symbolizes the human spirit that tears itself away from the animal domain, that frees itself from the animal and casts its gaze about, but has not yet completely grasped itself, is not yet free, does not yet stand on its own 2 feet. So for him, the symbol of Egypt is a sphinx, insofar as it's half human, half animal, rooted to the ground, because it hasn't yet, in a sense, appropriated, in that speculative moment, its nature. It's still tied to the earth, so to speak. It's still tied. Nature hasn't yet been spiritualized insofar as we don't yet understand that that which is outside of us is somehow essential to us. And so the symbolism of Egypt represents this emergence of self-consciousness, but not being totally free. We're emerging from the animal world in the sense that we're gaining autonomy, but we're not yet fully autonomous, so we're depicted in these mixes of human beings, the human form and the animal form. And all of the mystical kind of dimensions of Egyptian life is, in a sense, being mediated through animal symbols, animal powers. And for Hegel, this means that we're still, we being the Egyptians at the time, we're still, in a sense, captured by this nature-based religion, this understanding of ourselves is somehow rooted. And that is evidence for him that the Egyptians have not yet realized what it is to be free, what it is to be a self, and therefore, as he says, and I think I put this in the description on the flyer, the Egyptians posed the problem or the task of self-consciousness, but they didn't solve it. They, in a sense, were the first people to emerge from a kind of naturalistic self-understanding to start thinking of the human as somehow spiritualized in this Hegelian sense, but they didn't fully emerge. And the short story here, which I won't go into, is that that is why Egypt will not fall into or have a place in the category of world history. They are, in a sense, the foundation. They pose the problem, but the solving of the problem is when real-world history begins. And Hegel, in part, it's funny because Hegel, for Hegel, Egypt is a puzzle, an enigma. He always calls it an enigma, and he always refers to the hieroglyphs because there was no translation of the Rosetta Stone yet. It was unknown what these hieroglyphs meant, and for Hegel, it didn't really matter. They were symbols, and for him, they were symbols that couldn't articulate a self-understanding. They were too limited. They were too brute. They were too embodied, physical. What were they? They were animal figures. They were representational figures. They weren't abstract enough. And they didn't give the Egyptians the language to understand or describe themselves in a way that would allow them to break free from this naturalistic foundation. This is his reading of it. Now, that is quintessential Orientalism. So let me skip to Orientalism. So, I previously claimed that for Hegel, freedom is achieved only when we overcome all exteriority. When the objective, the other, the Gegenstände, the object, is overcome. And then we recognize that the object and us, the world and ourself, are just moments in a whole, which encompass both the subjective and the objective. This is the moment of the absolute. We can see in Orientalism as an ideology. That's great. As an ideology of exteriority, of radical difference, which reifies a moment into an other. So the claim here is that Orientalism does the opposite of what Hegel is talking about in the context of recognition. It takes the other moment and it reifies it. It radically separates it. It interjects radical difference between us and the other. That is, in a sense, the core principle of Orientalism. As Said writes, Edward Said, and this is the last quote on your handout, he writes, Orientalism is premised upon exteriority, that is, on the fact that the Orientalist, be they a poet or scholar, makes the Orient speak, describes the Orient, renders its mysteries plain for and to the West. He is never concerned with the Orient except as the first cause of what he says. What he says and writes, by virtue of the fact that it is said and written, is meant to indicate that the Orientalist is outside the Orient, both as an existential and as a moral fact. The principal product of this exteriority is, of course, representation. And it's a beautiful description of exactly what Hegel was doing and what his theory of recognition was criticizing. And even this line here that he says, he is never concerned with the Orient except as the first cause of what he says. That could be a description of Hegel's philosophy of history insofar as Egypt only serves as posing the problem which then history proper will solve but exclude Egypt from its history. So it's the only purpose of the Orient is to introduce a problem that then the West will solve. That's why I call it the quintessential Orientalist philosophy. It actually, in this wonderful move, wonderful meaning it's a bold move, it brings in Egyptian history just enough to have it be an enigma that can then be cast out, which then proper history can solve. The drive to create knowledge or a discourse about the other to represent the other is fed by the presumption that the other is incapable of representing or knowing itself. And thus the act of representation reflects an implicit claim to authority bordering on obligation. For if not us, then who will represent the Orient, is the claim of the Orientalist. This is a dichotomy of strength and weakness, of knowledge and ignorance. Said writes, such strength and such weakness are as intrinsic to Orientalism as they are to any view that divides the world into large general divisions. Entities that coexist in a state of tension produced by what is believed to be a radical difference. For that is the main intellectual issue raised by Orientalism, this radical difference. Now, the most important clusters or new discourses produced about Egypt revolved around the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798, the English occupation of Egypt in 1882, and American imperialism in the Middle East and North Africa since World War II. So, I'm just going to speak freely for a few minutes about the contemporary. So, the objective in thinking through these ideas is to try to diagnose to what extent our contemporary interpretations of the uprisings and social revolution that's happening in Egypt are in a sense marked by this tradition of Orientalist thought, this radical difference, this creating of otherness. And it's not, and one way I think of this as being, in a sense, my mere act of solidarity with Egyptians who are going through a revolution. There's not much that I can do, even though my national spirit has been very active in that part of the world and has actually had great influence on some of the factors that led to this revolution happening. So I'm not completely separate. But me as an individual, I am very limited in what I can do. And so I thought about this project, this paper, as my one small act of, in a sense, going through what I see as productive in Hegel's philosophy, to do some house cleaning on what is very unproductive and certain narratives that are being reproduced all the time. And what I see is not just a critique of our Orientalist interpretations of what's happening in the East. We see these all the time. If you read the paper or watch the news, you see people talking about people only understanding violence, or people really desire, we hear all the time, I hear it, they really desire a strong man. They really want a strong man to come in. And because the war condition right now is so much chaos, and people just want security and they want a strong man. And this is this kind of quintessential, they want one to be free. They want to be under one despot or ruler. They would rather have stability than what we're calling freedom, when it comes right down to it. Okay, that's pretty basic, pretty simple stuff. But the other thing that I think is productive in Hegel when looking at something about Egypt is the recognitive dimension of the uprising itself against despotism. Insofar as that within this polity, we can see forms of social resistance and social movements as, in a sense, embodying a critique of the social roles that had been dictated to them in the past. So it's, in a sense, challenging social roles which are not recognizing the self-understanding of the Egyptians themselves. So these are the two dimensions that I'm trying to bring together here. One is that there's an international dimension that's classical Orientalist, and the other dimension which is the social upheaval. What are the motivations for the upheaval? And I think Hegel gives a very good explanation of how people will, when misrecognized, struggle for recognition and if necessary, overturn governments. And I think what's happening in Egypt is a very nice example of that. It's not the only variable, of course, but it is, I think, if you look at the claims that are being made by those who are resisting in Egypt, they have a lot that people talk about freedom, they talk about dignity. Even when they talk about bread and butter issues, they're usually because people are not able to feed their families, and that somehow mitigates their ability to be dignified human beings. Right? And those are all, we can all read those as conditions of recognition. That